sit down. No, really sit down. All the way into that chair, the way you sit when no one is watching and you've stopped performing for the room. Good. Now give me 15 minutes. Not your whole life, not your whole story, with its bruises and its almosts and its long nights of talking yourself out of what you already knew. Just 15 minutes. You have spent years waiting for permission, waiting for someone to tap you on the shoulder and say, now you may speak. Now you may take up space. Now you may believe what your own bones have been telling you since you were small enough to fit in someone's arms and stubborn enough to already be planning your escape from every room that tried to shrink you. Nobody is coming with that permission. I want you to hear that the way you'd hear a door closing gently, not slamming, final but not cruel. Nobody is coming. Which means the waiting was always the trick, the beautiful lie that kept you patient, kept you quiet, kept you small in rooms built for people who never once questioned whether they belonged in them. Confidence is not a gift you're given. It is not applause. It is not the approval of people who benefit from your doubt. It is a room inside you that has been furnished all along. Dusty, maybe, unused, maybe, but yours. Every time you shrank, you didn't lose it. You just stopped walking in. So here is what will happen in the next 15 minutes. I am not going to hand you confidence like a gift wrapped in a bow. I am going to walk you back into that room. I am going to make you remember the woman, the man, the person who was never actually afraid, only convinced wrongly by voices that had no right to convince you of anything. 15 minutes, that's the whole ask. Everything else, the fear, the smallness, the apology you've been making with your posture, your voice, your silence, that we leave at the door. Now, let's begin. There is a particular kind of power that has nothing to do with noise, and the opening of this speech is built entirely on that principle. Most speakers who want to be called inspiring reach immediately for volume. They raise their voice, they quicken their pace, they throw out a rhetorical question and answer it themselves before the audience has even had time to consider it. That is hype. It borrows energy from the room instead of generating it. Stillness does the opposite. It asks the room to come to you, and in doing so, it establishes something no amount of shouting ever could. Authority that doesn't need to prove itself. Think about the moments in your own life when someone truly commanded your attention. It was rarely the loudest person in the room. It was usually someone who paused before speaking, who let a silence stretch just slightly longer than comfortable, who seemed entirely unbothered by whether you were listening or not. And precisely because of that unbotheredness, you found yourself leaning in. This is the psychological engine behind opening with stillness. When a speaker refuses to perform urgency, the listener's mind does something unconscious. It assumes the speaker already possesses whatever it is they're about to say. Confidence is communicated before a single argument is made, simply through the pacing of the delivery. This is also why the instruction, sit down, no, really sit down, works as an opening line. It doesn't ask permission. It doesn't apologize for interrupting. It gives a command quietly, and then it waits. That waiting is doing enormous work. It signals to the listener that they are not being sold something. They are being addressed by someone who has already decided the truth of what they're about to say and is simply giving the listener time to catch up to it. There's a reason this mirrors certain literary voices that favor weight over spectacle, sentences that sit heavy in the chest rather than sentences designed to be clapped for. That kind of prose trusts the reader enough to slow down, to sit inside a long sentence without needing it to resolve quickly, and then it snaps into something short and unbearably plain. The rhythm itself becomes an argument. I am not rushing, because what I am telling you does not need rushing to be true. Applied to a confidence-building speech, this matters enormously, because the entire message is that confidence is not manufactured through adrenaline or hype. It is remembered, uncovered, returned to. If the delivery itself were loud and frantic, it would contradict the content. A speaker screaming at you to be calmly, permanently confident is a contradiction the audience feels even if they can't name it. But a speaker who sits in silence, who speaks slowly enough that every word seems chosen rather than spilled, is already modeling the very state they're asking you to enter. The stillness isn't decoration. It is the proof. The second keynote does something quietly radical. It takes confidence out of the category of things you pursue and places it in the category of things you already own, but have simply stopped visiting. This distinction matters more than it might first appear. Almost every message about confidence in circulation, from self-help books to motivational reels to well-meaning mentors, treats it as an achievement. Build your confidence. Earn your confidence. Work on your confidence like a muscle you haven't trained. That framing, however encouraging it sounds, quietly reinforces the very problem it claims to solve, because it tells the listener that confidence lives somewhere out ahead of them, always slightly out of reach, always requiring one more course, one more win, one more person's approval before it can be claimed. Reframing confidence as something already possessed changes the entire emotional architecture of the message. It is no longer a destination. It is a homecoming, and homecomings carry a completely different psychological weight than achievements do. An achievement asks, what do I still lack? A homecoming asks, what did I forget I already had? The second question is far more stabilizing because it doesn't require external proof. Nobody has to validate a memory. Nobody has to grant you access to something that was never actually taken from you in the first place, only buried under years of other people's opinions, other rooms that made you feel like a guest instead of an owner. This is why the image of a room inside you that has been furnished all along does so much work. Furniture doesn't need to be built from nothing. It sits there, gathering dust, waiting to be used again. The metaphor tells the listener that the effort required isn't creation, it's re-entry. That reframing removes the exhausting implication that confidence must be constructed from scratch through willpower and replaces it with something gentler and, paradoxically, more powerful. You already know how to walk into that room because you've done it before, as a child, before anyone taught you to doubt the doorway. There's also a subtle correction happening about blame and responsibility. If confidence were something you had to build, its absence would imply a personal failing. You simply haven't worked hard enough yet. But if confidence is something you already own and merely stopped accessing it, its absence implies something entirely different. Interference, other voices, other institutions, other people's fear of your fullness got in the way. This shifts the emotional charge from shame to reclamation. The listener isn't being told they are lacking. They're being told they've been locked out of their own house by circumstances that had nothing to do with their worth. And this reframing sets up everything that follows in the speech. If confidence had to be built, 15 minutes would sound absurd. Nobody builds a house in 15 minutes. But if confidence is a room you already own, then 15 minutes is simply the time it takes to walk down a hallway you'd forgotten was there. Turn a handle you'd forgotten was yours to turn, and stand once again in a space that was furnished long before anyone told you that you didn't belong in it. The third keynote concerns the architecture of the sentences themselves, and it's worth taking seriously because rhythm in a spoken speech isn't ornamental. It's persuasive machinery working underneath the words. The style being invoked here draws from a literary tradition where prose often echoes the cadences of scripture, sermon, and oral storytelling. Short declaratives that land like a hand on the table, followed by long, winding sentences that spiral outward, gathering clause after clause before finally resolving. This isn't randomness. It's a deliberate oscillation between certainty and immersion, and each does a different psychological job. The short sentences function as anchors. Sit down. Nobody is coming. Now, let's begin. These are commands, or near commands, stripped of qualification. They don't explain themselves, and that refusal to over-explain is itself a display of authority. Only someone who trusts their own conviction can afford to say something so plainly and let it stand without cushioning. In a culture of speech saturated with hedges, I think maybe, in my opinion, a flat, unhedged sentence startles the ear. It reads as truth simply because it refuses to apologize for itself. The longer sentences do something almost opposite and yet complementary. They pull the listener into a kind of trance, a rhythm that mimics thought itself, thought as it actually happens, circling, qualifying, accumulating detail before arriving at its point. Consider the sentence about waiting. Waiting for someone to tap you on the shoulder and say, now. Now you may speak. Now you may take up space. Now, you may believe what your own bones have been telling you since you were small enough to fit in someone's arms and stubborn enough to already be planning your escape from every room that tried to shrink you. That sentence doesn't rush to its conclusion. It lingers, gathers emotional weight clause by clause, and the listener is carried along rather than told directly. By the time the sentence ends, the idea has been felt, not just stated. Hammer. Then wave. Declaration. Then immersion mirrors the way oral traditions have always taught and moved people from pulpit to porch to protest. It resists the flattened, uniform sentence length that characterizes most corporate or self-help speech, which tends to march along at the same pace regardless of what it's saying, numbing the listener through monotony. Varying the rhythm keeps the ear alert without ever needing to raise volume to do it. There's also an embodied effect worth naming. Rhythm this deliberate makes a listener feel spoken to rather than spoken at. The long sentences feel intimate, almost like being taken into someone's confidence, while the short sentences feel like punctuation marks in a conversation between equals, not a lecture handed down from above. Together, they produce a voice that sounds like it is thinking in real time and choosing its words with care rather than reciting a script. And that perceived spontaneity, even though it's carefully constructed, is exactly what makes the language feel alive rather than performed, weighty rather than rehearsed. The fourth keynote is about where the speech chooses to aim. Most motivational language aims outward, at goals, achievements, external markers of success. This speech does something different. It aims inward, directly at the private, often unspoken interior life of the listener, their fear, their sense of smallness, the specific quality of waiting that so many people carry without ever naming it out loud. This choice is not incidental. It's the reason the speech feels like it's speaking to one person rather than performing for a crowd. Consider the difference between telling someone you can achieve anything and telling them you have spent years waiting for permission. The first statement is generic. It could apply to anyone, and because it applies to everyone equally, it lands with no particular force on any single listener. The second statement does something far more precise. It names an internal experience so specific, the waiting, the quiet hope that someone would eventually grant permission, that anyone who has ever felt that particular ache recognizes it immediately as their own. That recognition is the mechanism of connection. The listener doesn't feel persuaded from outside. They feel understood from within, as though the speaker has somehow been present for private moments they never spoke aloud. This is why the speech doesn't ask what you want to accomplish. It asks what you've been afraid of, what you've apologized for without meaning to, what posture you've adopted to take up less space than you actually deserve. Fear, smallness, and waiting are not abstract concepts here. They are treated as lived, embodied realities. The apology you've been making with your posture, your voice, your silence is not a metaphor about ambition. It's an observation about how people physically carry unspoken self-doubt in their bodies, in the way they shrink their shoulders or soften their voice before disagreeing with someone. Naming that specificity is what makes the listener feel seen rather than instructed. There's also a trust being built through this interior focus. When a speaker demonstrates fluency in your private emotional experience, the exact quality of a doubt you've never said out loud, you extend them a kind of credibility that external, achievement-based language never earns. It suggests the speaker has either lived this themselves or has studied human interiority closely enough to describe it with precision. Either way, the listener's guard lowers because they no longer feel like they're being sold something. They feel like they're being accompanied. This inward aim also does necessary preparatory work for everything the speech promises to do next. If the goal is genuinely to make someone dangerously confident, that transformation cannot happen through external instruction alone. Telling someone to stand up straighter or speak louder addresses the symptom, not the root. Confidence collapses at its core from unaddressed fear and unspoken smallness. By speaking directly into that interior terrain first, naming it plainly and without judgment. The speech clears the emotional ground necessary for anything that follows to actually take hold rather than bounce off the surface. Unfelt and quickly forgotten once the words have stopped. The fifth keynote governs how the introduction ends, and ending well matters just as much as opening well, because a speech that closes weakly loses whatever momentum it built in its opening moments. The principle here is that the intro must not simply describe what's coming. It must actively pull the listener across the threshold into it. There's a difference between telling someone, in the next 15 minutes, we will discuss confidence, and issuing something closer to a summons, a challenge, an invitation that requires the listener to actively choose to step forward. The first is a preview. The second is a doorway. Notice how the intro doesn't end by outlining an agenda. It doesn't say, first we'll cover this, then that. Agendas are administrative. They belong to meetings, not to moments of transformation. Instead, the closing works by narrowing everything down to a single, almost ceremonial request. 15 minutes, nothing more. Everything else left at the door. This narrowing does something psychologically important. It removes the listener's excuses. There is no ambiguity left to hide behind, no vague sense that this might apply to someone else's problems rather than their own. The ask has been made small and specific enough that refusing it would require an active, uncomfortable decision, and most listeners, faced with that clarity, choose to stay rather than choose to leave. The phrase, "let's begin," is doing more work than its brevity suggests. It's not a summary. It's a command that assumes compliance, the same way "sit down" did at the very start. This creates a kind of narrative bracket. The speech opens with a command and closes with one, and everything in between exists to earn the listener's willingness to obey it, not out of submission, but out of recognition that the command serves them. By the time "let's begin" arrives, it doesn't feel like an instruction from a stranger. It feels like an invitation from someone who has just spent several minutes proving they understand exactly what the listener has been carrying. There's also a temporal trick embedded in this closing move. By explicitly naming the 15 minutes and treating it as a bounded, almost sacred container, that's the whole ask. The speech lowers resistance by making the commitment feel finite and safe. People rarely resist small, clearly bounded commitments the way they resist open-ended ones. 15 minutes is a coffee break. It's nothing. And yet, by the time that boundary is named, the listener has already been led to understand that inside those 15 minutes lies something that could genuinely alter how they carry themselves afterward. The smallness of the container and the size of what it promises to hold create a tension that pulls the listener forward rather than letting them hesitate. This is why the ending must feel less like a conclusion and more like a threshold, a place where the talking stops being about the listener and starts happening directly to them, where the intro's job of building trust, rhythm, and recognition gives way, cleanly and without ceremony, to the real work the speech was always moving toward.